Kathy, it's Favi here, and you can see that I have your design on my screen of my Hatch 3 embroidery software program. First of all, I want to draw your attention to the fact that I do have my hoop selected for the GR hoop, and I do have it at a funny angle. And that's just because I want to make sure that two things, that first of all, that you have your hoop orientation rotated properly for the orientation of your design, and this would be the top of the hoop or the back of the machine, obviously. Second thing, I know that you said that you wanted to stitch this design out in a larger size than what it had been originally digitized in. And so start off by making sure that this object file, it is an EMB object file, has been resized according to what you want for your final result before you start doing any editing to the design. So first of all, I want to just refer back to what some of your issues were that you were asking me about. And primarily that is that you were concerned about the original design had been branched and you knew that it needed to be adjusted. And one of the things that you were a little bit concerned about was that you want to make sure that where you have to cut the jumps between the connectors so that the face looks right. In other words, you were a little bit concerned about not having a line from an eyebrow to a nose, etc. But you also don't want your threads to unravel. So basically, not wanting threads to unravel means one of two things. Either you are going to have tie-ins and tie-offs, because those are your little knots, or pieces are going to connect together so that you don't have little knots here and there. Okay, you do acknowledge that some of the jumps between your pieces are very small stitches, and you say that you think it looks like there are tie-offs in those areas, but you're not sure if you have your settings right or if tie-offs would cause problems. And you're not too fond of the auto trim on some designs, and I'm with you on that. Sometimes I don't like auto trims either. But back to tie-ins and tie-offs. Why are they there? Because they have to be there so that little tiny pieces like what we're looking at right here don't unravel. But there's a couple of different ways that you can deal with that. One of them is if you are going to have little tiny pieces like this. Oh, and when I selected this, the whole design became pink because it is a branched design. So what I want to first of all do is I'm going to unbranch it. In other words, I'm going to break it apart so that it does take it out into its original little sections. And when I did that, look at those gazillions of jump stitches everywhere. So one thing I want to say about all these bazillions of jump stitches is this is the way that this design was originally digitized, I think. And for example, it was not done in a very logical manner. So the very first thing I do want to address, actually, and I know I'm getting off topic from talking about the tie-ins and tie-offs, but it's still kind of part of the same idea, is that you don't even have pieces that are related to each other next to each other in some of these places. So this is object number 1, and it's right here in the middle of the hoop, somewhere in the middle, and it's part of the shoulder of this little person right here. And then the second object in the design is way down over here in the far left bottom corner. So one of the problems with when you are digitizing is that you do need to have your things close to one another. So if it's this little boy up here, you need to have all of his parts of his body next to one another here in your object sequence bar. So I don't know why some of these pieces are so far apart from one another. I know that that's not necessarily the case everywhere. For example, I'm looking at the cuff on his t-shirt, and these are the two cuffs on it, and there's a neckband, and this is part of an arm, etc. But so I think that one of the first things that I would want to say is that I would resequence things so that each person's pieces are at least next to one another, so that you're not having the machine jump around all over the place. That will also aid in getting a good branched design or redwork design. You could use one or other of these two tools to put this all together. But your other concern is about tie-ins and tie-offs, and one of your concerns also, which is a valid one, is that you don't necessarily want to have connecting pieces, where you want this to be an individual eyeball, and you want this nose to be all by itself, and you want the mouth to be all by itself. But when I turn on the True View, turn off the True View, and I start looking at all of these tie-ins and tie-offs, there's a couple of things that you do need to consider. And in order to have a good stitch out, sometimes it is going to be better to go ahead and have some of these pieces connect to one another. And one of the things, look at how many there are just in this little section right here. Here's the top of his eyelid, and you've got, I'm presuming it's going to start here and it ended over here. And then it jumped down here to do part of his eye. And you even had a little jump, from the eyeball, the iris of the eyeball, back up to the eyelid again. So some of these pieces do need to be connected together in order to get proper stitch outs. So one of the ways that you can do this actually is just coming in here and selecting some of these objects, turning on the reshape tool, and connecting these little lines. Just drag these nodes so that it's touching something else. All right, and the reason why you want to do that is because when the branching tool or the RedWork tool starts to read this design, it's going to do a better job if you've got these little pieces connecting to another little piece that it's going to be connected to eventually. All right, here's this jump here. You've got to jump all the way from the tie-in of this part of his eye. I guess that's the pupil of his eye, or maybe the iris, I don't know. And it ties off here, and then it's jumping way up here to work on his eyelid. So one thing I want you to consider here is the distance between some of these places. Now, I know that you said you didn't want necessarily for things to connect, but let's just look at this eye, for example. I'm going to turn on my measuring tool, and I don't know if the measuring tool shows up when I'm recording, but take my word for it. I'm measuring from the top of his eye right here to that part of his eye right here. And it is only 0.39. Oh, I'm going to turn my metric measurement on because that makes more sense to me. So now we'll measure from here to here. 1 millimeter. 1 millimeter between his iris of his eye to this part of his eye is a very tiny amount. If you're not familiar with how tiny a millimeter is, I would like for you to get out a measuring tool that has a metric system on it and look at that millimeter. It's tiny. And you are much better off having a connecting point of a stitch connecting this little section to that section than to have a tie-in and a tie-off. Tie-ins and tie-offs can be helpful. Yes, they do make little knots, and that's wonderful for us. But at the same time, that tie-in and tie-off, if it's going to get trimmed, will have an opportunity to get unraveled, especially if we are manually trimming it ourselves. And so there's two things I want to say about that. One of which is if we are going to use tie-ins and tie-offs for objects that are close to one another, sometimes what I would prefer to do is have that be a longer jump rather than a close jump, because a longer jump is going to give us a better knot if we're going to manually trim it ourselves with our little tiny scissor snips. We'll have less of an opportunity to accidentally trim off the knot. And if the machine is going to tie it in and tie it off for us, it's actually a little bit better for it to have a little bit more of a jump area also, rather than it being too close together. So consider that for your starting and ending points for objects that are close to one another. So if this was mine, this is probably what I would have done. I probably would have had a connecting stitch between this tie-off and this next little piece where it's going to tie in. And again, resequencing some of these things is going to be really important. So we have over here on our sequence bar, it's doing this part of the eye right here. This was the tie-in, this was the tie-off, then came the iris, and we could change the starting and ending points of that so that it's a little bit closer together. So I would have maybe put it there and tied it off here. And did you see when I moved the starting point, it added in a stitch for me, all right, which is pretty cool too. So that way that object did connect. And maybe we don't want it to you know, I could even have it, oops, I got the wrong thing here. I'm going to get the end point and I'm going to move the end point to where it started at. All right, and then that's also possibly would eliminate having a jump there. So working on some of those little placement of starting and ending points for some of these things might be helpful. Another thing is that you need to have pieces connecting to another piece whenever you're using branching or red work. Your objects have to touch another object. So I know that this could take a lot of time to actually do this, but it will help to eliminate tie-ins and tie-offs as well. So finding those spots within your design. Let's just say, for example, this part of the person's ear right here. Let's select that object. Let's move it so that instead of it coming, you know, unnecessarily out into the area of his hair, you know, drag that point back so that it's just touching this line here. Same thing with this ear part over here. Let's just drag it over so it is connecting with. And sometimes it's easier to see it if we've got it in true view for some of these little objects here. This one here looks like it did all right, but how does it work when it gets all around to here? You know, just making sure that everything touches something else wherever it's actually possible for that to happen. This eyeball, again, down in this area here, you know, it's so close together. I know that you've got this as two separate objects. Turn off true view so we can see that. But it doesn't need to be two separate objects, and I would rather you put a little connector between something than to have them be separate pieces. So do you know how to do that? I could quickly do a little demonstration. There's a few different ways you can do it. My preferred method is that I like to use the traveling toolbar, and this process is called seeding, S-E-E-D-I-N-G. So what we do with it is we make sure that true view is not turned on our design. And another thing that might help actually is because in our design settings, under our background and display colors, we can change our unsewn stitches from black, which is the default, to a different color. So basically when we're using our travel toolbar, anything that it's basically traveling through the design and showing us how it stitches out. So the unsewn stitches are going to be black by default, but if we wanted to change them to a different color, we could. And the reason why I'm saying this is because this design right now is digitized in black. So when I turn off the true view, it's going to be black, and when I hit the home key on my keyboard, all the unsewn stitches are in black, which means that as we're traveling through this design, it's not going to be so apparent which are the unsewn stitches and which are the sewn stitches. I hope this makes sense to you. So you could do one of two things. You could change your unsewn stitches. Let's just say we're going to change them to bright pink. Okay, so now unsewn stitches are bright pink, and when I hit my home key on my toolbar to travel through this design, everything is pink, right? But when I start hitting my forward button on my keyboard, everything will turn black as it's starting to get stitched. So I'm going to just zoom in closely here and see how it's turning black. That means that this stitch is stitching. And see, that was crazy. That was that one I mentioned earlier. It stitched out that little part of her shoulder, and then it zooms down here to stitch this. So first of all, get this thing resequenced so that you've got pieces that belong to one another, close to one another. That's going to take some time, maybe. Can't say for sure. Haven't examined the design that closely. But then let's just say, for example, that we're going to work on this little guy's face. I think what I'm going to say right now, Kathy, is that I'm going to assume that a lot of these pieces are not close to one another. You know, what if, for example, you've got lots of places where part of one body is way distant from another section, you know, as it was digitized. One of the things I might suggest doing is that you would get all of the parts for each kid and make sure that they are resequenced properly. And one of the ways that you could do that, which actually might take more time than this is worth, is that I'm going to escape out of this function here to try to describe what I would do. I would maybe try to grab all of this kid's head, for example, and just make sure that it's all together. Now look at this. I'm showing you something funny here. So part of his head is way down here. Where's the rest of his head? Here's a good part of his head here. So things are not sequenced in a logical way. And when you try to use branching or red work, it's going to have a difficult time trying to do a good job of it, just simply because these pieces are not even close to one another where they should be for a good stitch out. So I think what I would maybe want to suggest doing, change the color of those to red. Let's try to get the rest of this guy's shirt and stuff and change it into red. You know, do you see what I'm trying to tell you? I would try to find all of these parts and I would try to get them next to one another so that they are, you know, and we can see here that we've got pieces. This is part of his arm, so that belongs together. Let's find that part of his arm. You know, getting things close together in the sequence bar is going to be really, really important to, first of all, to get this to be a good stitch out. And then I think I would probably start to work on the stitch starting and end points of each one of these stitches. Then what I think I would do is make my decisions based on practicality. So let's just say, for example, like I was saying a little while ago, you know, this little face, I know you may want these pieces to not connect together, but I think they ought to connect together just for the sake of a good stitch out. So what would I do? I would select this nose piece probably here. I would hit my reshape tool and I would just go ahead and have one or the other of the ends of this little object touch part of the other nose piece. So I would just probably do that. You know what? It doesn't make that much of a difference. The other thing here, also here's the ending and starting points. I would just drag it on down. You might want to add a point in here to get that back up over there. You know, look at that. You know, it didn't make that big of a difference in the overall effect of the stitch out. Same thing might go for his little mouth down here. You know, maybe selecting this little piece here. Let's move the starting and end point so that it's touching this piece that's right up above it. All right, like that. Again, doesn't make that much of a difference in the overall stitch out. I'm going to hit number 1 on my keyboard so you can see the actual size of that. And you know what? For being able to possibly sacrifice a tie-in and a tie-off, it does not make that much difference in the overall look of that face. So that would be my one preference, is I would go through this design and I would connect pieces that I possibly could connect by adjusting the nodes on them, or maybe possibly even adding in pieces in between. So that's where I was at when I was using the travel toolbar. There's that process that's called seeding. And let's just say, for example, that I wanted to work on this little face, on these eyes. What I might possibly want to do is I would find all the red. Look how it's all broken up here into different little sections. I would find all the red. I would cut it out of here. And the reason why I'm doing this is because when you use the travel toolbar, you don't really want to have to travel necessarily all the way through the entire design. So this is the way that it works. You turn off True View, you hit the home key on your keyboard, everything will turn black because it's unsewn, and then you can just start hitting your forward button and seeing how this design is stitching out. If I hit the forward button, it's moving, that's your arrow forward button at the bottom of your keyboard, one stitch at a time. All right, and if I hit the downward arrow, it's going to jump at 5 stitches at a time. So typically I like to go 1 stitch at a time. So the other buttons on the little travel toolbar down on your keyboard is the backwards button, goes backwards 1 stitch at a time. So I'm going to go backwards 1 stitch at a time. This is a jump that it's dealing with right here. All right. If I hit the upward arrow, that's going to go backwards by 5 stitches at a time. So forward, forward, forward. So we've got to end right here, and then it's jumping all the way up to this. All right, it jumped from here to here. I'm going to go backwards. Don't want to spend too much time doing this, but okay, so now I'm going to use my forward, one stitch at a time. Looks like this is a triple stitch. Right there it tied off, and it's now jumping to this tie-in right here. All right, that's a tie-off and a tie-in that are absolutely unnecessary. So how much time do I want to spend fixing this design? Well, it's all up to you. But the way I would fix it is I would be using this travel toolbar. I would find that spot where this one ended up, where it was tying off. I would then turn on my digitize toolbar. I'm going to digitize an open shape. I'm going to choose my single run, and I'm going to digitize one stitch in between that tie off and this tie in. Hit your enter key, voila, they're gone. All right, I'm going to then stitch, stitch, stitch. Again, it's a triple stitch, and it's going to jump from here all the way down to somewhere over here. Where exactly? Looks like it's this spot right here. So what am I going to do? I'm going to backtrack, right? I'm going to digitize a line, but I don't want it to come over here. I kind of want to follow the line of his little arm. So I'm clicking, and I'm going to make a couple of stitches in between here and here. That's just one stitch point. Come over here to where the little tie-in is at. Click on it, enter, and the jump stitch disappeared. Now it's wanting to jump all the way from here to somewhere over here. So again, you know, we just don't have things path, or they're not even put into places where we've got some logical things going on. So probably the best thing would have been was the next line that should have been near these lines would have been this right over here in order to do this seating process properly. But, you know, one of the things that we can do possibly is just see, you know, how would the program have branched this? You know, so there's two different ways of doing this. You can do your branching yourself by seating and selecting things and putting things close together. Probably what I would do is I would probably concentrate on doing that for the facial features as much as possible, and then maybe letting the branching or RedWork tool do the rest of the process for you. So in other words, I would do some preliminary work. I would, you know, come in here to his little face, and I'm just going to be jumping now by 5 so I can get to the facial features here. It's going to take a little while to get there. Okay, so we're up in the face now, so I'm going to jump back by 5. So we can see here that his ear, inner part of his ear stitched, and then it was jumping all the way over to what? Let's jump, jump, jump. So it's doing the other part of his ear over here. You know, and now it's doing his inner ear. Now it's going to jump, looks to me like to do something on his hair. Yeah, it's doing his hair. It's going to come around. So we've just got stuff all over the place, and the branching may do a good job at fixing that. But let's get over to his eyes. Presuming that his eyes are all pieces that are close to one another. A little bit difficult to tell at this point without having to be there yet and not looking at it in the sequence bar. Oh, wow. So it did eyebrows, and now it's going all the way down to do a crease on his shirt, his body. Now we're going back up, and we're going to work on his mouth. All right, so it's jumping up to his mouth. Let's just see what it's doing over here. It's doing the bottom lip when I adjusted the line on that a little while ago. All right, it's going to jump up and want to do his nose. So that's a jump stitch. Do I want to have a line there possibly? I don't know. You know, that would be one of the places where I would say maybe I would want to put a line in there. Maybe I wouldn't. You know, that's just going to be a design decision. But let's just say we do want one. So I've inserted one. Enter. Let's continue traveling around. It's going to do this part of his nose, that part of his nose, and now it's going to jump, jump, jump up to an eyeball. Again, design decision. What might possibly be an option here? Maybe what I would do is I would digitize a line from here to here. Maybe I would come up to his eye right here. Maybe I would come all the way around. Hit the enter key and get rid of that jump. You know, I think that, that might be a good way to path that eye. Then I would continue stitching around. What's it going to do here? I think it's going to tie off and jump. Yeah, it's jumping down here to finish this part of the eye. So again, you know, that's an unnecessary jump. It's so close together that you're better off putting in a little tiny stitch here. Right? I'm doing a straight stitch here. And I'm doing a little bit of a curve. I'm attaching it to that tie-in, hitting my enter key, and it has now connected those spots. Let's continue fixing this eye. Just come back around. It jumped from there to there because I think I fixed that a while ago. I think this is doing a tatami weave. I probably would do this as a satin. Okay, it's going to tie off over here at some point. Yeah, tied off there. And it's jumping from here up to here. So maybe what I would want to do here is kind of simulating the little connector point that it had already done previously. Connect to that. You know, another option maybe would be to connect it down here to this part of his eye. Either way, come back up here to where that tie-in is at. Hit the enter key, and we've now got that all connected. So now what we've got, I'm going to turn on the true view, is we've got these little tiny pieces that are connecting the colored part of his eye with the outlined shape of his eye, and it's not that obvious. Again, what am I going to do? I'm going to hit number 1 on my keyboard so we can see this as a real life size. And you can see that, you know, you really don't even hardly see where that thing connected. It just added a little bit of character. Another thing that we could do is just pick a closer spot. So let's undo. And let's turn off our true view, and we're up here. So let's go backwards a little bit. Backward by 1 stitch. Oh, I'm going by 5. So let's go forward. Let's get to the end of where that little iris was tying off before it started to jump. Back up to where it's jumping. This time I'm going to connect in a less obscure spot from here to there. That's probably about a 1.5, maybe not even, millimeter spot. Got rid of the jump. Let's look at it in true view. You know, so that's a pretty good connecting spot. So again, you know, how much time do you want to spend fixing these things? Where is it going to be more important to not have pieces connected? You know, I don't think that this looks bad, especially when I consider that this is what it actually looks like in real life. You know, and just pathing it, figuring out where it's going to be okay to connect things together. Once you've got this little person all fixed up like you like him, then what I would probably do is I would cut him. Not probably, that is what I would do. Select him, cut him, go back to the original and paste him back in there. All right, and I would probably do that with each place where I feel like I've got a lot of correcting to do, and then just getting them back in here and kind of putting them in an order. Let's just say as you look at this design, you know, thinking about it in a logical, dimensional way, you know, who's furthest behind and who's closest to the front. Thinking about it that way too, because that probably will also affect how the branching or the red work tool will work. So, you know, this little boy, his body is far behind, but his hands are a little bit forward as they're on top of these kids' heads. This little girl to me looks like she's the furthest behind. You know, this little girl is further behind these children that are here in the front, etc., etc. So kind of select the objects, fix them, put them in a logical order according to 3D dimension, and then go ahead and try your branching and red work tools. One other thing I want to mention to you about what is the difference between branching and red work. Red work is only going to stitch each line that has been digitized or each object in 2 passes. In other words, it'll come down one time and it'll pass back over it another time in order to get it to connect to the next object that it wants to connect to. Branching will sometimes add in multiple rows of stitching in order to accomplish that same thing. Red work is going to start and stop at the exact same point in this entire design. So you will pick your starting and stop points based on where you want it to start and end. And depending on what you pick, that's also going to affect the way that the design stitches out. Red work will also give you the choice of letting the program choose that spot for you. So let's just turn this little boy back into the black color. And everything is now black. So basically this is it, all right? So I'm going to select my entire design. And I'm going to use red work. And you'll see that down on the status bar on the bottom of the screen, it's going to tell us to click once for the entry and exit point, or press enter to place the point automatically. So we can choose it by placing our entry and exit point wherever we want. Let's just say I want to put it right there. It'll take a couple of seconds for the program to process that information. And then we could actually watch the stitch out to see how good of a job it actually did for us. Or if I chose to let the program choose it for me, I would have just hit the enter key. So it looks like this is kind of getting logged up a little bit here. I don't know why. It's trying to generate the stitches. It's telling us down here on the bottom toolbar, and it did it. So if I look at this here, I can see that. Let's see. Another thing I noticed earlier when I was playing around with this design is that sometimes using the red work tool, and this is why I'm zooming in over here, it actually either eliminated some of the stitches or might have changed them. I don't know why that happened. Has to be probably something with the way that it was originally digitized. So let's undo that red work. I'm not happy with how it did that. So basically that's the thing. Red work will stitch over each part 2 times. Always 2 times. And it will begin and end at a specific spot. Now, branching is a little bit different. In that branching, we do have to choose where we want it to start and end. See here, it's telling me to enter our entry point. So again, let's just say I'm going to start it. Let's just pick something. I'm going to start it here on this little kid's neck. And then let's say I want it to end over here on this shoulder. I don't know, it's just random. You know, it'll take a couple of seconds, again, for the stitches to generate and for the branching to happen. And then, you know, you could look at your stitch out, watch it through the travel toolbar and see if you like the end results. And just keep playing with those starting and ending points. Sometimes branching works better when you've got a lot of different kinds of objects, and maybe that's what happened with those eyeglasses changing. I don't know. No, look, those glasses are changing again. Isn't that curious? Have to investigate that. I don't know what the deal is there. Another thing before I close out this video is that, you know, looking at some of these other objects that are in here, like this the bat on this little boy's Batman shirt, I'm going to undo that branching. And I would just have you look at stitch lengths and look at stitch properties on some of these pieces and make sure that you've made good choices. All right, so I better close out this video. I've chattered on long enough for now, and I hope that this has been helpful. Bye for now.